This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Hi, everybody. As is tradition, we have some folks joining a bit late. If bear with us, we'll get started probably a couple of minutes for the folks who are coming in now. We should be underway shortly. Also, as a friendly reminder, those of you who are members of the committee or if you're a consultant, please turn your webcam on during the meeting after we get going. Easier than looking at a page full of blank screens for everyone. Okay, it's 3:03. Let's start with everyone. We're going to get this thing underway. I'm going to start by taking attendance, and we'll turn it over to John, who will chair the meeting. As with last time, I'm just going to go down the list. Say your name and you're here. Please say here. We'll use this in addition for attendance purposes to check your microphones. So, John Cooney.
Here.
Boris Burstein.
Here.
Brad Brown. Jonathan Cedarbaum. Take profit from not be here. Bridget Dooling. Toby Dorsey.
Here.
Don Elliott.
Here.
Guy Feldblum. Okay. Russell Frisbee.
Here.
Alexandra Givens,
Here.
Josh Jackson.
Here.
Thank you. Kristen Johnson,
Here.
John Kaminsky.
Here.
Thank you. Mike Livermore. Gillian Metzger.
Here.
Deirdre Mulligan. She may also be joining us a bit later. Nina Olson.
Here.
Oh, no, always Pascott's not trained. RT Rye. She may also be joining us later. Connor Rosso.
Here.
Ricky Revez. Okay. Virgil Ross.
Here.
All the trees.
Big Shapiro.
I'm here.
Thank you. Coach Stewart.
I'm here.
Steph Tatham.
Hi, I'm here and I'm joined by Jonathan Hill, an expert from OIRA's Privacy Office.
Right up on my list next. Jonathan, you want to do your microphone check?
I'm here, thank you.
And Anthony Schultz.
I am here.
Fantastic. Any members whose names I did not just read? Okay, and then as a reminder, as with last meeting, we will have members coming and going throughout the course of the meeting. That's fine. If you have to sign in, sign out, perfectly all right. And on that note, John, I think we're ready to get going.
Thank you very much for coming back today and your contributions on the draft of the statement. I want to give you just recap of the ground rules for discussion very quickly. And they are that ACUS members have full speaking privileges and are able to unmute themselves. But to avoid background noise, I'd ask that you keep your microphone on mute when you're not talking, and add comments in the chat feature if you'd like to speak, and I'll try to call on you. Second point, members of the public, please use the chat feature to indicate if you'd like to speak, and I'll turn to you at an appropriate point in the meeting, and the person running the GoToMeeting function will unmute you. She'll then remute you when you're done speaking. For all participants, please use the chat function only to indicate that you'd like to speak, or please do not hold any sidebar discussions or put substantive comments in the chat feature. And then finally, only members of the ad hoc committee, including government members and their designated alternates, public members, senior fellows, liaison representatives, only they have a right to vote if a vote is to be called for. But I don't think a vote will be called for today, so I'll leave that discussion just to remind you that there will be limitations imposed on who is eligible to vote if we get that far. Now, for today's meeting, thanks again for your very useful comments on the statement. There are basically three topics that we'd like to discuss today. The first one is the major topic, which is this a useful statement? Do we have the issues identified properly, and if we filled them in properly based on what you know and based on what the consultants have added? We'd like to divide this up into a couple of chunks. The first is major topics of discussion. Overall comments on the overall statement. Is there something fundamental that we left out? Have we captured what should be captured? Are there topics we didn't include that should be there? And are there topics that shouldn't be included? I'd like to spend about 15 or 20 minutes to give people an opportunity to speak if they have an overall comment on where we're headed on the statement and things that should be taken care of in the next draft. And then once we have that initial batch out of the way, we'll go section by section through the, I think there are 8 topics that are here for today, and you'll have a chance to go through your comments section by section as to whether you think that there are things that should be included, shouldn't be included, should be emphasized, should be de-emphasized. So we'll have 2 chances to go through that, which is why I'm trying to keep the overall fundamental topic to as short a discussion as we can. And there only if we have real fundamental whoppers that we didn't get right or that we left out. So once we've gone through that discussion of the major issues that are before the House, we have 2 smaller issues that we'd like to get covered toward the end of the session. Topic 2, the format of the statement. As you'll see, it's all narrative at this point. We have an introduction and then narrative introductions to each of the first 7 topics to be discussed. And the question that we'd like to ask the members of the committee is, you will eventually decide the format for the document. And one thing that we thought we should ask you specifically is if the format ought to be modified to have a overall preamble to each of the 7 sections and then bullet points under that, or rather numerical points where we would set those aside for emphasis by putting them in separate numbers. And any other suggestions about formatting that you may have. And then finally, for the last 10 minutes or so, ACUS has asked that we ask you to brainstorm the point as to whether there are other projects that ACUS should be considering. We have a good number here, but are there other things that could be done usefully to make an even more useful set of principles that the agencies could rely on? On that, it really is brainstorming. We'd like people to suggest ideas that ACUS ought to think about and that would add something. And you don't need to discuss those at great length, because if there are good points there, the ACUS staff will call you back sometime before the next meeting and make certain that they understand what you're trying to say and give you a chance to speak in greater detail about why you think this would be a useful addition. So again, that will be brainstorming at the end, but there'll be follow-up on that. So you'll end up having a full opportunity to speak one way or another. So with that description of the 3 major topics, the major substantive contents, the structure, preambles, formats, how that should be used, and finally, what else should we be doing here? Additional suggestions for projects. So having gone back through those things, I'd like to open it up by asking if anyone would like to kick us off on the topic of whether we have the fundamental issues defined correctly. If we have in there, what should be in there, and if there are things that we have in there that should be left out. Would anybody like to kick off the discussion on the fundamental point? And I'm looking for the something to come up in the chat column. I think it just have Matt. Before we get going, though, should I've been filibustering. Would you like to kick it off with your own perspective, the important perspective about what we're trying to do here?
No, I think it's better to hear from the committee members. I just like to thank very sincerely everybody who's joined here. This meeting and this committee process illustrates something that we often say about ACUS, and that is there's an extraordinary amount of time and money that's donated to ACUS, and we very much appreciate it. I would rather just turn it over back to you, John, and hear from the committee members on this. I don't frankly think my perspective is that valuable on the substance here. I would like to say something when we get to what you I think referred to as the last 10 or 15 minutes about suggesting further areas of study. I do have a few comments there, but I'll reserve those comments until then.
Very good. I don't have any requests from members of the committee. Jonathan Kaminsky, you're first up, and then I'll come back, and today I'll follow the same rule that I did last time around, which is if we don't have anybody who's volunteered, I'll ask the consultants if they have anything to say, which they were very good about having last time and kept the meeting flowing. But John, we'll start with you.
I just want to quickly affirm the suggestion that artificial intelligence be defined up front. I think that there is a wide misconception of what it is. And even though we may not be fully precisely inclusive with the definition, that having one will be very helpful in framing what is and what may not be foreseen as what is artificial intelligence. And I can help craft that if the staff feels uncomfortable. But I think Kerry probably has the most wonderful definition already in his report.
Thank you very much, John. You are still the only person in the queue, so I'll ask the consultants if they wish to speak on the overall issue as to whether we're treating all the issues that should be treated and whether we're doing that adequately in your view. Knowing that you'll have a chance to comment individually on each of the 7 items when this overall review is completed.
John, if I may, this is Kerry Colanisi. I first want to echo John's point about definitions and suggest that there's 2 distinct elements that I think are important to keep in mind. One, with respect to machine learning, the black box nature of it, the learning that is in some sense autonomous by these algorithms once they are designed by humans and set forth to process patterns within data. They're somewhat autonomous. So that's one aspect of that makes machine learning different than a non-learning algorithm, and I think that's important to keep in mind for definitional purposes. The second dimension is the degree of automation, or what's sometimes thought of as the human in the loop versus human out of the loop. And I think those the recommendations that follow may hinge on the degree to which the algorithms we're talking about, or as they're applied, are autonomous in the learning algorithm sense, and they're supporting automation in the human out of the loop sense. So those are 2 dimensions I would urge considering that are related to definition. And the other point I just wanted to make was really to reiterate what I think was your suggestion, John, in the comment on the draft, that we think about who the audience is first and foremost for this statement. And I certainly could see a variety of different audiences, but I wondered if you thought that might be helpful to get some comment here on the group here as to who the statement really ought to be aiming to speak to, because I think that will help ground then a lot of our deliberations going forward about the more specific points or issues that we'll take up.
Yeah. Well, in response to that, I think that one of the challenges in this domain is that technologists seem to think they have the answer or know something, and it's the people that are in the agencies that have a decision authority over whether AI is used, such as the attorneys or agency officials, that they're the ones would be the target audience. So I'm thinking that the target audience of this is those that will have to sanction the use of AI. It's not targeted towards the technologists themselves. So that's why I think that AI includes natural language processing, it includes video, it includes a lot of things other than letting the computer make a decision. So, and I think that being able to explain that there's these bounds, you may not want the computers making independent decisions around certain kinds of things, but that should not preclude the rest of the kinds of AI that are out there, automated process re-engineering, all these stuff. So,
Kerry, do you want to respond to that? Or my next stop would be Steph Tatham, who has some comments about the definition of AI.
I'm happy to see it, although invite others if they have thoughts about whether Congress is contemplated here, or other possible audiences.
John, may I just jump in here on this thing? I mean, the obvious simple answer is, first and foremost, federal agencies. That's what ACUS does. And yes, Congress as well. And yes, it should be as accessible to the public as possible. But first and foremost, agencies. Whom exactly within agencies, that might be worth some further discussion.
Because in part you'll have the people who are going to design and run the functions, and in part the people who are involved in procurement, and then policy people overall. I can see that it may be necessary to break that down into subcomponents to catch their attention when the draft, or I'm sorry, when the final version is circulated to them. The people who've written in and say they want to discuss specific matters, I'll call on you first when we get to that topic, but I thought for now we'd keep focused on the topic of the definition. And Steph, I believe you're up next.
Yes, thank you, John. Jonathan Hill and I discussed this issue, and we were somewhat hesitant to include a definition of AI, in part because in our experience, there just hasn't yet been a universally accepted definition that's come into focus in our government work. Perhaps the closest that we've seen is the definition contained in the 2019 NDAA, which isn't perfect, but has been referenced elsewhere, including OIRA's draft guidance. But I guess we were trying to better understand what the value was of defining AI versus the potential trade-offs, because we were concerned that if the definition were overly limiting, people might not understand this recommendation to apply to work that they were doing. And we thought that that could be a potential downside of a definition. And a second point to make on if AI were defined is that we would want to be careful not to pigeonhole AI as a technology when in fact it amounts to a broader information system that would rely on data and personnel in addition to information technology. So just for example, there are parts of the recommendation that discuss technological expertise. We might recharacterize that as technical expertise because we believe that agencies' ability to effectively implement AI will require reliance on data scientists and statisticians as much as IT professionals.
Anyone want to follow up on Steph's comments? I don't see anything coming up on the chat feature, so I'll declare this issue open and now closed for comment, and I'll get to the question whether there are any other fundamental issues that people think should have been addressed, or fundamental issues that should have been addressed differently, and see if anyone wishes to address the House on that point. I'll give it a second.
John,
Go ahead.
This is Steph Tatham again. I didn't want to jump to the next issue, but on the more fundamental issues, I think we did want to open up the discussion of privacy a little bit. And, our thinking just in the current framing of the recommendation is that it seems that privacy is relegated to a subsection when we believe it's a fairly pervasive issue in AI when we're dealing with personally identifiable information. We felt that managing privacy risk is really going to be crucial throughout the entire life cycle of an AI system, and that there might be privacy implications in some of the different sub areas that are discussed in here. So transparency, bias, procedural due process, capacity building. So our hope, and we don't have specific language at this moment, but we'd be happy to work with you to offer some, would be to maybe include some upfront discussion, maybe in the second paragraph, explaining the importance of privacy generally, and that there may be privacy considerations that come into play into each of these different areas, and then maybe pulling the discussion of privacy out of where it is below and making it its own section.
Does anyone else want to continue the discussion of the privacy issues? I take your point that you basically want to flag up front that the privacy issue is going to be an important feature in virtually all the issues that we're going to discuss at greater length. There are two ways to handle that. Would be if there are people who have additional points they want to call out now, or whether they want to leave this issue to Mark and the ACUS staff and to work with you between now and the third meeting. Well, I'm hearing nothing about privacy further, Mark. I think that this was one that will be handed over to you. And while the discussion of privacy has been going on, we have a couple of other issues. A couple of other people have raised their hands and want to be speaking on this preliminary issue. So Deirdre, we'll start with you, and then we'll come to Toby Dorsey after that.
Hi. I'm not sure if it's coming to me because of the comment in chat or more generally, but I have to get off the phone shortly for another meeting. The UCs have a new presidential commission on AI that I'm part of, and so I'm going to have to leave for that. I wanted to raise a few questions, and I've been sick, and so I didn't have the time to read this as carefully as I would have liked to. So I expect I'll send some more comments in writing if that's okay. I did want to raise a question about, just the opening framing makes claims that AI is lowering cost, improving quality, making agencies more consistent and predictable. And I don't actually feel like we have the research basis to make those statements. And I don't think it serves us well to make bold statements that are not well supported by empirical work. And so if other people believe that we can make those claims grounded in empirical work, that's great, but I don't think that we should be, I don't think you should be making those sorts of claims up front. I would certainly like to see some more specificity in the sort of things that there should be transparency around for different sorts of audiences, as well as kind of some more specificity about the things where there should be kind of expertise from the agency and potential opportunities for public input. And I don't yet see that reflected in the draft. And I think that, as we know, there are really important values that are being set. And I think there are some good administrative law precedents talking about things like choices of model and the selection of data, questions of thresholds, and those things being like policy matters, not just being things that should be left to implementation or delegated to technical systems. And I think it would be useful to provide some more specific direction of the sorts of things where we need not technical experts, surely we need those, but experts in the domains, because many of the systems that we've seen that have raised concerns, it hasn't been the lack of technical expertise. It's been basically the replacement of domain-specific judgments by judgment of technical experts. And I'm sorry that I'm going to have to leave.
Well, thanks. I appreciate your getting that in while you were still with us. And it may be an issue that needs to be followed up on, so we understand what's in the domain of more specific information that you thought should be in there. It might be useful to get examples of those.
Hi, this is Brad Brown. I would support what was just said there. I think that largely a couple of things, and I think it goes back to the definition. It would be more comfortable for me, anyways, if we used like something like AI techniques, because I think there are more, agencies who are trying to use aspects of AI, like machine learning and natural language processing and things like that, than what's kind of thought of generally as AI, which I think leans more towards things like neural networks and things like that. I think also, the problem is a lot of these agencies are struggling with basic data problems. I mean, to the notion that you're going to get to kind of the AI the way that it's kind of thought of more generally, we see it all the time. I mean, there's legacy data all over the place, and you're not going to really get to the notion of AI until you get the data issues straightened out, because a lot of the stuff that's out there won't even begin to work until you can get the data organized in a way that it can work. Even in the most basic machine learning has got that problem, and that's virtually in every agency. There's pockets of agencies that can go use it for, use techniques of AI like machine learning for specific things, where they've spent a lot of time putting together data sets that they know will kind of work, for example, for decision making within an agency. But short of that, there's not a lot of places where you're going to plug and play AI right off the bat without doing a lot of work on the data.
Good, thank you very much.
Yeah.
To continue along this line, Toby Dorsey, could I turn to you? You've given us all in the chat feature a good short form version of your comment, and I wonder if you'd like to expand your remarks on what you think ought to be done.
Sure. I think that my reaction on reading this overall was, number one, staff did a really great job of pulling together something that is very articulate and clear. So kudos to everyone who worked on this, and thank you. I come down thinking with the idea that this is a little more exuberant than I feel about this. I'm not sure what the sense of everyone on the committee is, but I certainly feel like we should be encouraging agencies to move forward in this area, but whether we move forward with exuberance or trepidation, I lean more towards, I'm more of a half trepidation than a half exuberant, I think. And so I really appreciated that Kerry in his report sort of outlined, I think, towards the end of his report, he outlines some of the different sort of, I would say, levels of agency deference to AI, going from, just using simple, analysis and observation to inform agency decision making to, at the other end, actually making the decision. And I felt that sort of spectrum was really helpful. It was my favorite part of the report, honestly, and it was really helpful. And I would like to see some of that, maybe just a brief encapsulation of that in here, to point out that there are different options. There are different levels of engagement that an agency can have with AI techniques. So that's all I have.
All right, thank you. Next up is Don Elliott with a comment on this point briefly.
Yes, I agree with the point that we ought to be careful not to seem to be too exuberant. I think that was something that we discussed the last time, and I was surprised to hear the comment made that this came across as perhaps getting beyond the evidence and suggesting how valuable these techniques are. I think that's because of the word many. I think it's very important that we say in many cases it does these things. And I'm not sure that I think the consultants' reports really document or support the notion. So I would propose that we be a little bit more true to the underlying statements in the backup, which is that, in some cases, I think we have examples to support these things, but I don't think we're yet in a position to convey the impression that, the majority of the time or most of the time, or in many cases, that AI has these positive characteristics. So I would just suggest maybe a little editing there to be a little bit more cautious and stick to what the reports really show.
Thank you. That's a point that's well made. Next up, Catherine Sharkey speaking about Deirdre's comments on public participation.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe echo one thing that might be thematic and maybe is related to two things, both the potential overexuberance point, but also the purpose of this statement, the audience to whom it's addressed. If we think of it with respect to addressing federal agencies, it might be that we could have some value added in terms of thinking through which types of uses that entail which types of the kinds of issues that are going to come forward, bias, transparency, et cetera, which ones merit or call for, public comment, and which ones agencies can just go ahead and deploy. Because it strikes me that there are very different kind of fundamental uses. So some of them could be things that are just, that are not as policy based. And my understanding too is that agencies are grappling with this issue right now, namely which types of things they can just go ahead and do and which types of things they should put out in a notice of proposed rulemaking and get public comment. So it's not really addressed as of yet, and I thought that was an interesting point that she raised.
All right, thank you. Carrie, your work has been the subject of some of the discussions. You're up next.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to build on the first part of Kathy's comments and connect it with Don's point too on the exuberance, which I certainly don't think the ACUS statement should get ahead of the evidence or be unduly exuberant. So I'm fully supportive of Deirdre's original comment and Don's echoing that it probably just needs a little bit of wordsmithing. But I would want to put in a plug for keeping much of what is in the statement already in this regard. Perhaps reframing it not that we have demonstrable evidence in many cases that AI does achieve the goals that are stated in the statement, but to convey that the rationale for agencies to consider AI is precisely to achieve the kind of goals that the AI statement or the ACUS statement, draft statement right now lays out. And the reason is I think it's important to remind agencies that they should have a particular problem or use or goal in mind, not just be pursuing AI tools just because it happens to be the latest craze or some such. So I think the tenor of that statement ought to stay, even though it might be reworded slightly so it's not indicating that we actually have evidence in many cases about what AI is doing. One of the recommendations in my draft report is that agencies consider validating their use of AI tools, and I think we have, always, I think across the whole federal government on a number of issues, a need for greater retrospective evaluation, and that would certainly be something that we need more of in the AI area, and that could be also a separate section perhaps that might be added to the statement itself. I didn't see that really reflected in the current draft statement.
Thanks, Carrie. And I thank the entire committee for the discussion. You've given ACUS a lot to think about, I think, here in productive ways. So I thought unless something clicks up on the chat feature, I'd like to turn to Nina Olson to dig down a little bit on her comment that this is an aspect for interagency review of policy, and I'm not certain exactly what she has in mind. But I wonder if, Nina, you could expand on that, and then after her comment, of course, another one just clicked in, that we'll move to transparency and we'll open up with Sid Shapiro on that. But for now, Nina Olson, you have the floor.
Thank you. My comment was in response to Kathy's comment about public participation, and I was observing that often in the development of artificial intelligence programs, et cetera, internal folks are not consulted, that they do not have the same level of review of decision making that would go into making a policy, instructions to staff, if these very things were just written down and said, employee, you do X. And so I think that transparency and that same kind of thinking through what kind of circulation do you need to do inside the agency and to what parts of the agency, so you ensure that the right people, not just legal, but ombudsmen, operational folks, et cetera, have an opportunity to participate. My experience has been that often it's a core group of people who are used to working with the experts, the technological experts, and they tend to become a black box in and of themselves, and they don't reach out, and that's where you get problems with the system.
All right, thank you. A couple of additional requests to speak have clicked in, so I'll turn to those quickly. Deirdre, would you like to follow up on your chat note?
Yeah, and this will be the last two things. One, I just wanted to emphasize that what Nina was saying, I think, was exactly what I was trying to point to earlier, that there's continually an emphasis on the need for agencies to have technical expertise, which is incredibly important. But I think it's really important to make sure that the right kinds of experts who are doing the frontline work and other parts of agency practice are part of the development team. And I can't underscore that enough. And then the second thing I wanted to say is that often there's a lack of comparative assessment. And we see this with technology, right? Generally, people adopt new things. And Carrie's point on validation, I think, is absolutely correct. But I think if we want to understand whether or not this is making our practices more just, more fair, more equitable, more efficient, and particularly claims about kind of cost effectiveness, I think we need actually comparative assessment, not just validation of the tool. And I can tell, from a related area, like you can look at the adoption of various surveillance technologies, and those are often touted as things that are going to be cost saving. And that doesn't always turn out to be the case, right? They certainly shift revenue, but they don't necessarily save revenue. They just, push it outside the agency instead of keeping it inside. And I think that we need to think about comparative assessment and think about what are the metrics against which those systems should be assessed. And it shouldn't just be cost effectiveness, but it should be the other important things that you've already teased out in this report with respect to, procedural issues, transparency, etc. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak twice before I leave. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And this time we will finish off this phase of the discussion with Bradford Brown as the final speaker.
Yeah, I mean, just my only comment was, I think, that when you talk about these techniques in any environment where there's an adjudication or there's a decision being made, the pushback comes from when it's a pure machine learning environment. It's a lot easier to have the conversation as where a cognitive assistant is helping a human, make a better decision. That's a lot easier conversation to have than purely, machine learning or some capability like that, making a decision that's typically thought of as a human decision. I think when you move more in that direction in the current culture, it gets dicier for people to accept that. That was my only point.
All right, thank you. Seeing no other comments, we will move on now to transparency. But before we go to Sid, I just want to thank everybody who commented. It's a pleasure to watch you hit the ball back and forth to each other and develop the depth of thought that's going into this. So it's been a pleasure to listen to. Sid, you're up on transparency.
Thank you. It struck me that there's a relationship, or ought to be maybe, between transparency, auditing, and bias. So to the extent it's true that there are constraints on transparency because of proprietary concerns, because of the difficulty of explaining how the artificial intelligence works to make it accessible to people in the agency, let alone the public, we lose accountability. And to the extent we lose accountability, then it seems to me it's possible to ramp up auditing or to put in more protection against bias, because those things can occur without public accountability. So I'm wondering about the links between those two or three.
Would anybody like to be heard on that issue or other issues on transparency? Was that a hand up, Carrie?
Yeah, if I may, I think it's a good point, and it actually, in a way, relates to the point that Steph made earlier, which I also thought was a very good one about privacy. And however the ACUS statement is actually drafted, it might be worth highlighting that these issues that are addressed in the statement are interconnected. I take that to be largely Sid's point, that and Steph's point earlier about privacy as well. And maybe, you know, again, I don't know how you want to organize the statement, but it could be that if you continue with the separate sections, nevertheless have something in the opening to say that even though you're proceeding for exposition purposes with each issue separately, that there are interrelationships with, and then maybe that would also allow you perhaps to highlight some of those interconnections as you deal with each issue.
Yeah, I think Carrie, the latter may be important too, to the extent we agree that, say, for example, limits on transparency have an effect on the need for auditing. We can just mention that, not try to solve it, but just mention that interconnection.
I'd like to encourage people to use the chat feature if possible. None of us apparently learned the coronavirus way of staying safe by not putting our hands to our faces. And there are a number of those. It's hard to tell apart from somebody who's raising their hands to be heard from somebody who's just had a little scratch they needed to scratch. Thanks for those comments. Anybody else? Toby Dorsey just saved me by weighing in on transparency.
Hi, I mentioned this in our last discussion. I just want to repeat it here that maybe this goes under transparency, maybe it goes under something else, but I think we need to acknowledge that we're going to have oversight from Congress and from GAO, and we're going to need to prepare for that. Agencies are going to need to have a plan for how they're going to address that. Who is going to be the person who's going to testify? Or what information are they going to be able to make available?
Thank you. Next up, Nina Olson to comment on transparency, and her background in enforcement activities will help here.
Well, I noted that we talked about in the report that there may be places where, you know, you cannot publicly disclose the policy underlying it or the choices that you've made in this system or how you're using this system without triggering, basically your enforcement strategy. And my comment to that is that we already have a robust system of deciding what's official use only. Sometimes I think it's overapplied, but that's my personal opinion. And in the context of FOIA and eFOIA. But I think we also need to, and this also comes up later in the discussion, we need to really talk about what we mean by enforcement. So for example, if you're using data to identify, terrorist cells, et cetera, that's one use. If you're using a system then to decide whether you're going to prosecute this person, are you going to apply a penalty against this person, those sorts of things, that's another thing entirely. And I think there we need at least some transparency on how these systems are being used, for what tasks within an enforcement environment they're being used. So maybe it's making a distinction, or maybe defining where there is, where there are enforcement concerns for its use, as opposed to where you have to be very careful in masking it, and giving it secrecy that it does not warrant.
Thank you. Nothing new has come in on the chat feature, so I wonder if anybody else wishes to be heard at this time about the transparency issues and the way it's reflected in the this draft. And I'm not seeing anyone volunteering to step forward on this, so I guess I'll make one more round of the room saying, are we ready to move on to the second issue, judicial review? And when we get there, we'll start with Don Elliott, but I wonder, one last chance for people to comment on transparency before we move on. And seeing no chat features and no hands up. Don, please start us off on judicial review.
Yes, I had a specific comment at line 71 and 2 in the draft and the footnote, which cites citizens to preserve Overton Park. I have recently been working on Baltimore Gas and Electric deference, which says that the deference should be particularly great when decisions are made on, quote, the frontiers of science. And I presented a draft paper on this at a workshop at the Gray Center on Friday and got some very useful comments. But the reason it's relevant here is there is a case, and I can send a short article that cites it to Mark, but there is a case called Hayward versus Department of Labor, in which the court specifically refuses to consider whether or not the relevant factors were built into the AI program. And it merely cites Baltimore Gas and Electric for deference. It was a case in which it was a claim for compensation by a widow whose husband had died after working in a radiation exposure environment at the Department of Energy facility. And her lawyers argued that the program, the algorithm, did not take into account the rarity of the particular kind of cancer he suffered from. And without addressing that issue, the court simply affirmed. And I think this notion that simply because AI is used, there should be greater deference. There's a debate in the literature about whether or not Baltimore Gas and Electric is so-called super deference, or what some of the authors have called its no-look deference. Looking at the lower court cases, the ones that cite Baltimore Gas and Electric do not, in any case that I've found, actually consider whether or not a decision was based on a consideration of the relevant factors. So I think in some way or another in the footnote, maybe we can specifically disapprove of the Hayward case, but I think that broad use of Baltimore Gas and Electric deference, simply because the decision is made by artificial intelligence, would be an example of what the reports, I think, correctly criticize as automation bias. So I think we've got to be clear that this that the statement that we make about what the courts will do is correct. I think it's very important that the artificial intelligence program be based on a consideration of the relevant factors, and I don't think it's appropriate when somebody raises such a challenge to just cite Baltimore Gas and Electric and be done with it.
Thank you. I look forward to reading the presentation you gave at the Gray Center when they put that up online. Alexander Gibbons is next. Carrie Colonnesi is on deck.
Thank you. My comment is about lines 61 and 62. There's a sentence about many AI systems will fare well under the Matthews v. Eldredge framework. I think that falls in the category of a line that is a little too optimistic and likely needs to be called back. There are a number of cases now where systems really are actually having challenges under those standards, in large part because they're failing under notice and for lack of ascertainable standards, because of the complexity of explaining the factors that lead to the ultimate decision. I fear that the language as now makes it sound like the main types of concerns aren't judicially cognizable, but those certainly are, and I don't want us to give them short shrift.
Thank you. Carrie?
Given that the audience is agency decision makers, I think it would be helpful in this section to add even a sentence, but maybe a couple, indicating what agencies might need to do to be able to justify to a court the choices that were made. And I know there's some language here that indicates, for example, that agencies be able to understand and provide at least some explanation of any decisions made that are a basis for agency action. But I think, and maybe this is picking up on John's and even just to recognize, certainly, as Alexandra said, that there is some litigation that's arising over algorithmic decision making. But quite frankly, there's been for many years, even before AI, as the Hayward case, for example, that Don points to, but others as well, where there's complex algorithms, statistical analysis that agencies rely on. And I think it's good practice for agencies to be able to document the steps that they undertook to design an algorithm or an algorithmic-based system, the choices that were made, and the rationales for those choices. So I think it could value, there could be value in elaborating more than is in this current draft, the need for agencies to think about, in effect, building a record for possible litigation.
Thank you. Boris, you have a comment that just came in, so take it away.
I just wanted very briefly to echo and tie together the last two comments. It struck me in reading this section that it places perhaps too much emphasis on stating what courts will do, and perhaps places too little emphasis on what we want agencies to do to facilitate judicial review or otherwise comport with due process principles, so or APA principles. I would just suggest reframing this section with that concern in mind.
Thank you. Would anyone like to follow up on that comment? On Clue, a couple have come in here. Thank you. Let me get back to them. Catherine Sharkey, on Don Elliott's point.
Yeah, actually, I mean, Boris just took the words right out of my mouth. I do think this should be framed as in agencies, what we want to say to agencies in anticipation of judicial review. I would just add that I think we should just acknowledge as a group that we're waging then into a big debate. so it'll be because there's a raging debate, as Don, I haven't read Don's piece, obviously, but I've engaged, there are people like Adrian Vermeule who've been touting for a long time thin rationality review as opposed to State Farm hard look review, and the type of record an agency would need to build, kind of depends on that. So we'll have to, I don't think we'll resolve that question. It's just putting it out there as a marker that we need to be cognizant of that.
Very good. That sounds like a good risk disclosure to the agency people who will be reading this. Let's say David Engstrom, and then, well, thanks. Don Elliott has just sent in a copy of his article, and I appreciate that. David, you're up next.
Great, thanks, John. I had a pair of comments about the next to last and last sentence of the section. So that would be lines 78 through 82. So first focus on that next to last sentence. It starts out, appeals in individual cases are not an effective means of doing systematic correction. And that notion of appeals in individual cases feels like it's referring to adjudication. And I think a really important point to make and to make clear to agency officials is that some of these algorithmic decision-making tools, and indeed some of the most important ones, some of them that represent some of the most coercive actions that agencies can take, say in the enforcement context, are not going to be reviewable because of a bunch of administrative law doctrines. This is something I mentioned during our last meeting. That could include Heckler, it could include the ripeness doctrines. It's a bunch of things that hive off enforcement decision-making from judicial review. And so that sentence to me felt a little too spare. I wonder if there's a way to make a little clearer that we're talking about a variety of aspects of administrative laws that's currently structured. That means it's going to be very difficult to correct systematic errors in these tools. So I guess I would say another sentence, or at least something that conveys to agency officials that there actually are these kind of gray areas and these discretion zones where there isn't going to be much in the way of judicial review. Turning to the final sentence, then it says it encourages agencies to focus their efforts on systematic reviews and oversight mechanisms. That follows from the previous sentence. It's precisely because we're not going to get much meaningful accountability because of the existence of these administrative law doctrines. But I felt that that felt a little spare to me as well. I wonder if there's a way to make it more concrete and some concrete examples of things that agencies can do to create systematic review and oversight have already come up in our conversation. So I think, I'm pretty sure it was Nina who mentioned the possibility of an ombuds person, right? A single point of accountability for thinking about the design of a tool or thinking about whether a tool is still serving the purposes it's meant to serve, whether it needs to be decommissioned. I believe Deirdre noted the importance of having an inclusive development team right at the outset. That's another example of a concrete thing that I think we could reference to try to fill out that notion that agencies maybe should be thinking hard about oversight mechanisms in light of the lack of legal accountability. Even questions about who within the agency has access to machine output. So in the enforcement context, I think a lot of agencies are thinking hard about whether the line level prosecutors should actually get the precise risk score. So it might be that someone within the agency creates a list of potential regulatory targets that have been flagged by a tool, but the actual line level investigators who then have to go out and work up the case don't have the particular risk score, and that avoids this problem of feedback loops where these systems can become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in any event, just to wrap all of that up, I think that final sentence too felt a little spare to me and could be built out, and it wouldn't be hard, I don't think, to just provide 2 or 3 or even 4 concrete examples of what we mean when we say systematic reviews and oversight mechanisms.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move on unless anybody has a final comment that they might like to make about judicial enforcement. I'd like to get to auditing, and no one has stepped up yet to be first in line on that. So I'll appreciate any last comments on judicial enforcement or first comments on auditing. Going once, twice, 3 times. We're in auditing now, and we still have no chat features up on the line. So I wonder if my usual technique, ask if any of the consultants would like to be heard on this point. Jillian Metzger, thank you for volunteering. You're muted.
Sorry. I just wanted to say that I really liked the last few comments, and in my own comments on the draft, I had been going through and had that same concern about sort of flagging the systemic review features and then got to audit. And the only suggestion I would have is to maybe frame up and showcase more that these two concerns are very much linked. So the audit part is precisely critical, or one reason it's critical is because you're not necessarily going to get that from judicial review, and judicial review might not do it particularly well. But to use that in a way to sort of say part of how you show that your artificial intelligence system is not arbitrary and is well thought out and should meet all those requirements is that you have built into it the same kind of structural systemic protections that ensure the kind of accountability that is harder to obtain in court, but it could nonetheless be a feature of what makes a particular use non-arbitrary.
Thank you. So we now have a number of comments. Carrie Colonesi will be next, then John Kaminsky and Bradford Brown in that order. Carrie?
Sure. I want to just sort of build on one of Jillian's points and suggest that maybe also it's a global point. You might think about how all of these sections are ordered in the document. It is a little, it seems to me odd to have bias coming after auditing, right? Because some of the things that you would want to be looking for in auditing might be worth explicating. So it's just a global point that I think maybe can be taken up at a later point, is how these issues are organized and what sequence they're framed in. But I also wanted to just put in another plug for thinking about this section more broadly than just the term auditing might imply. I think this is not only important for auditing for validation purposes up front, but Deirdre already, I think put it well to say that we should be thinking about comparative assessments. I had that's what I had in mind with retrospective review in this context. So I would urge thinking about this broadly, or at least defining what we mean by auditing a little bit more all-encompassing.
Thank you. Actually, this may lead into the next comment from John Kaminsky.
Yeah, I think that the word audit is maybe too confining for what I think the concept is here. I think the concept is that there needs to be some sort of review. There's several kinds of review. There can be a review by technical experts as to the code and does the code work. There is a review by subject matter experts as to whether the models that are being developed are actually reflect what reality is in areas. For example, if it was to be used to help prosecutors to make decisions on whether to grant reductions and charges or something, that you have prosecutors and you have police officers on a panel saying this is not how the system works or whatever. So it's not just being done by technical people. And then there would be this notion of a public review of, is there bias, is there transparency, sufficient stuff. So it's not just judicial review, but there's different kinds of review. And I think that that's the concept that this AI audit is trying to capture. But I don't think when I think of audit, I come across with maybe somebody with more of an accounting perspective. So having worked there.
Thank you, John. I'm glad to see that the last couple of comments have brought other people forward. Bradford Brown next, then David Engstrom, and then Daniel Ho. Bradford? I can see that his microphone is on, but I haven't been able to hear anything.
Now? There we go.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I agree with what John was saying. I think that the reality is that more often the quote audits are more agency reviews, that happen informally to try to improve, an agency process. And so I think that if we're going to use that word audit, we're going to have to define it.
Thank you. David Engstrom?
So I think this is largely just a issue of word choice. I think it's easily remedied, but in my view, the first two sentences of the section can be read to imply that auditing is only important when an agency sources an AI tool through the procurement process. And I'm not sure that's right, and I'm not sure that's something we want to suggest.
I see John Kaminsky shaking his head. And if you're speaking, John, it's you need to unmute. There you are.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's not just looking at code that's been produced by external contractors. It's a concept that's much broader.
Thank you. Daniel Ho, and then David Rubenstein.
I agree with much of what has been said, and I guess just to kind of tie a couple of these threads together, I heard Carrie articulate that maybe there should be a section that's a little bit more general about evaluation. He mentioned retrospective evaluation. Deirdre mentioned stakeholder participation. John K. Generalized it to forms of review, and I heard Jillian actually tie this in the earlier section to forms of oversight. And so I guess I would potentially think about whether this section should be sort of retitled to something like oversight, with different forms of oversight being mentioned. And I think the one kind of knock on audits too is that audits can be quite episodic. You may not expect a GAO audit of your tool once every 10 years. And so where I think a lot of this to me would be going is that there's a form of oversight that is more like quality assurance and quality improvement, that is ongoing, prospective, to understand how a system is operating as it is rolled out. And I think building in sort of evaluation into that process would be really important.
Very good. David, you're next, and then Alexandra Gibbons.
Thank you. Let's see if I can get my camera going here or not. Yeah, thanks. My question or comment had to do with auditing, which I think ties to earlier comments about what exactly we mean by that. But on some level, I think we'd need to have some sort of a metric, something that we're auditing for. And when it comes to AI development, those or either the tools themselves or how they're developed, we are still without sort of standardized metrics in the private sector and in the government sector. So, for example, of course, you want to measure for accuracy and make sure that there isn't function drift and that sort of thing. But we're talking a lot about things like bias, or it goes under the name of fairness, in the literature, and transparency. But we don't have any metrics. What would we be auditing for? I mean, what is it that we're shooting for in these audits? As Carrie pointed out, we could also be auditing, I think this is a really important point, in terms of process. So what types of decisions were made, what are the data sets that were used, and but even with regard to process, we may have made best practices from the industry or otherwise, but we don't have any standards, we don't have any metrics currently that apply uniformly. And I know NIST is working, and of course is organizations all over the globe working on standards and metrics and things like that, but currently we're without those things. And I don't really see that mentioned anywhere in this write-up as a challenge to be thinking about.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Alexandra now, and then if possible, go on to bias. But Alexandra, you're up next.
Great. And Nina, I saw you had a comment as well, but I was about to cite you, so maybe it'll end up speaking for both of us. I was really glad to see that this last paragraph calls out that agencies should be aware that the AI can affect how agency staff do their jobs, but I think we would benefit from being more explicit there. Last meeting, Nina gave us some wonderful and very powerful examples from the IRS's experience. There's a body of literature out there. There's a phenomenon, the phrase automation bias means something. And so I think using stronger language here or just clearer language will help better illustrate the types of concerns that we're worried about. Otherwise, there's a real risk that the average reader will just gloss over this paragraph without internalizing what we're actually trying to articulate as a potential risk.
Well, thanks for that comment. Nina, would you like to complete the discussion on this item?
Well, I'm seconding what Alexandra said. I think Mark is going to send out, after the conversation, I located 2 of the documents that I referenced at the last meeting, and he's going to send them out for everybody's reading pleasure after the call, or not pleasure, or whatever.
All right, thank you. Seeing no other chats in or hands raised, I propose that we go on to bias. And here again, on this issue, we don't have anybody who is asked to be first in line. So I wonder if anybody would identify themselves. And Sid, thank you very much. You're up next.
It does seem to me, we were talking about judicial review earlier, that agencies need to be in a position to defend their use of AI as not introducing bias, either under arbitrary or capricious review, or we were talking about identifying, for example, targets for inspections. And if you're talking about an administrative subpoena or administrative search, you have to show you're using neutral criteria for that search. So I don't know enough about it to know whether or not transparency and other limits make that possible at all, but it does seem to me there is that interconnection.
Thank you. Who wishes to be heard next? Am I actually having a meeting organizer's dream come true? That there's an issue here that is more or less not objectionable to the group as originally framed. Well, then let me put the question a different way, which is, are we ready to move on, or would anybody like to be heard further on this before we move on? Okay, I see a couple mics have just come on. Daniel Ho.
Yeah, this is a comment, I guess, about a little bit, asking for a little bit more language around line 118. Agencies should work diligently to identify and combat biases in the AI they use. I think one very common challenge faced when trying to do a kind of bias audit is that agencies may not actually have full access, for instance, to protected attribute information. And then there's a question about whether the form of bias we're worried about is disparate treatment in the form of explicit classification as a feature input in the algorithm, or whether we're talking about disparate impact. And so I guess I know there are there's a lot of the sort of machine learning literature assumes that protected attribute information is available. And it may be worth it here to sort of articulate what some of the alternatives are, given that a lot of agencies are simply not going to have that information available. So there are ways of doing this through record linkage, through imputation methods to actually facilitate forms of bias audits, even when you don't necessarily have ground truth on protected attribute information.
Thank you. Let's see, next up, Catherine Sharkey. I see the BC Brown light is on, but nothing's come up in the chat feature. If you want to speak, could I ask you to put something in the chat feature? Catherine, you're next.
Yeah, so
Toby Dorsey.
I don't want to burst your exuberant comment that we're all in full agreement on this section, but I mean, I have to be honest, this section to me seems quite unobjectionable, but I'm not sure what it's telling agencies. So I guess this relates to some things that have been phrased as framing, but maybe if we were talking about either oversight or public comment, then as part of what we're suggesting to agencies, we could have them think about the extent to which they would have to explain, as Sid was pointing out, that there's not bias in a particular way, et cetera. And so just to be very particularized in this language, where it says, for example, around line 120, establish processes to ensure that people with diverse perspectives are able to inspect the AI. It's not really clear to me what that exactly means. Again, it could mean something to do with oversight, either internal or external, or it could have something to do with putting something out for public comment. And it just, I don't know, it just reads a little bit kind of like anodyne and not as in these are recommendations we're giving to agencies to think about in particular ways.
Thank you. Toby Dorsey is up next, and then if somebody else doesn't weigh in looking to speak, after he speaks, we'll go to capacity building where Boris will be leading us off. Toby?
Thanks. I don't have any objection to this whole section on bias. I did start to ponder, you know, we are working on a statement here rather than a recommendation. And so I guess I'm looking for guidance on whether it really is proper for us to be putting all kinds of normative things into a statement. I'm okay with it, but I was wondering whether someone on staff or perhaps you, John, could address that.
Would somebody on the ACA staff like to take a hand at that? You have a lot of experience with the use of should. Mark, did I see your hand up? You're not broadcasting.
I can jump in, John, if that's helpful. Am I coming through? Or?
Yes, sir.
Great. So short answer is, we've had variation among the different statements. Some of them do use the sort of should language, which I think is fine. I think the difference, of a statement vis-a-vis a recommendation is with a statement, we're not specifically looking for agencies to implement specific things, but I think it's perfectly fine to say, agencies should be aware of the following issues, or they should be mindful of the following pieces and addressing this topic. So I think as it presently is phrased, I don't at least personally have any sort of heartburn as to sort of the level of normativeness, if you will, that the current version is using, and I think there's some precedent for that. So hopefully that's helpful. I don't know if Mark or Matt have anything further.
Toby used the word normative. The statement's going to be necessarily normative. Maybe it's a little bit less detailed and prescriptive and so on and so forth than a recommendation, but those are really matters of degree. And my advice to the committee would be, don't worry and do what you think is best given the state of the record.
Hey, thanks, Matt. I've seen Carrie's light has been on for a while. Carrie, if you have something to say, fire away, and then Radford Brown, and then we'll move on.
I'll pass. I just inadvertently kept it on. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. One last comment then, Bradford.
Yeah, I guess, most of the bias issues you see here are in the underlying data. That's really where the question of bias comes up most of the time. And there's things you can do to correct those biases that exist in data, but that's a lot of times if an agency is unaware of it, where the problems arise. I also was wondering about the question we're referring to inspect AI, which to me sounds like questions about, and that's come up a few times in state case law, relative to inspecting the underlying logic, behind the analysis or what. I wasn't quite sure what we were meaning there.
All right. Thanks for raising that concern. I think we're ready to move on now, and we'll get to capacity building. Boris, you're up.
I wanted to make one general comment about this section. It struck me as I was reading it that it's framed substantially around the question whether to build or buy. And the considerations set forth for that decision don't seem to be any different, or at least any different in a qualitative way, from any build or buy decision an agency might make in an area requiring substantial technological expertise. And so I think if what the committee wishes to do is make a claim that there is something somewhat different about AI, something qualitatively different from another area requiring technological expertise, I wonder if that case can be made more directly or more poignantly. I'm sure I'm one of the least qualified here to actually make that case myself, but I offer that comment as a generalist.
Thank you, Boris. Well, that invites the question whether people who have been intricately involved in this field for a while would like to address the question whether there really is something different about AI in the buy versus develop yourself category. And let's see. David, you're next, and then Don Elliott. Oh, or did I miss one? Excuse me one second while I double check.
I would just want to second. I'm sorry. Is it okay, John? Can I go?
Go ahead.
Okay. I would just want to second or just amplify that point about make or buy, because I'm of the mind that AI procurement is not business as usual, precisely because of the value-laden judgments and the trade-offs that get embedded in the technology in ways that you don't have, certainly with many goods, but even with many technological systems. And without taking any, hard positions on what should be different about it in terms of prescriptions, it definitely is different. And another thing to consider in this regard is, to the extent that the government is going to be procuring or developing this technology with outside vendors, the push is to get away from the traditional waterfall methods and do more of the agile sort of modular, fast sprint kind of contracting, where there's going to be many decisions made sort of on the fly in ways that are very different than the types of procurements that we're used to seeing with regard to IT systems in general, and certainly with respect to most other things that the government's buying. So I just want to amplify that. Probably could say something more about that there if we wanted to.
All right, Don Elliott next.
Yeah, so I think one factor that is different and should be perhaps called out is that oftentimes if you buy, there are proprietary limitations on the ability to make the models available to others outside the government so that they can run them on their own data sets. And that's something that is specifically a number of people have commented on. So I think that should be mentioned, that there should be some sensitivity to the proprietary information aspects. I don't have a lot of experience with AI per se, but I do have a lot of experience with what really amounts to being AI, and that's the use of complex models in particularly EPA decision making, where the issue of the proprietary nature of some of the models has been an issue. So I would just suggest that we call out specifically that the proprietary information and ability to make the algorithms available to others outside the government should be called out. Not necessarily determinative, but a factor to be considered.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Would anybody like to comment either on Don's thought specifically or more generally on this issue, or are we ready to move on to delegation and accountability? I don't see any further requests to speak on this topic, and given that we're starting to run short on time, I'd propose that we go to delegation and accountability, and I'll ask the same old question in a different way, whether anybody wants to tee up the issue of delegation and accountability and comment on it. The I have
a question, at least, or the part about the FAR and the prohibition on the use of contracts for the performance of inherently governmental functions, I guess depends on who ultimately has the ownership, right, of what the system is, right? The fact that it may be developed or designed by the private contractor, even if it, let's suppose it is for the performance of an inherently governmental function, it's the algorithm that would ultimately, or the artificial intelligence system that would be performing the inherently governmental function. Right? Not necessarily the contractor who designed the system, right? So it's not as if there's a human in the loop that's a private contractor making the decision. It's an automated, if we're thinking about at the extreme, a system where we're totally automated human decision making in the governmental setting, it's a tool that's been designed by a private contractor, but the private contractor is not making those decisions. It's the tool, right? So I think that may just, for the benefit of agencies, I don't know. I think we might want to make that a little bit more precise or clarify exactly what the prohibition might entail, or at least maybe just make it more general and just even say, just be aware of the possibility of a prohibition on contracts for the performance of inherently governmental functions.
Thanks, Kerry. Don Elliott, back to you.
Well, I agree generally with what Kerry said, but the exception is if the private contractor in writing the program is deciding what factors are considered and what factors are not considered. So I think we should call that out specifically, and I see Kerry nodding, but you can have a situation in which the government delegates the inherently governmental function of what factors are considered in the algorithm to a private contractor, and that's what we should caution against.
I would agree with that, and I think that's what I had in mind also, is just to clarify exactly what we have in mind. I don't think that there's necessarily anything inherent about hiring a private contractor to help design one of these systems. If the system's making the decisions, that's not really running afoul of FAR. And if the agency is making the fundamental value choices that are going into the design of the system and are adequately overseeing that system, then I think there's not a concern about violating the FAR.
Thank you. I'm delighted to see that Toby Dorsey's light has come on. Toby, you had a lot to say about the FAR process last time around. You're up if you wish to comment on delegation and accountability for this round. Thank you.
Thanks, John. When I raised this last time, I really had two different but related points in mind. One is, I think we should be concerned about the spirit of the FAR provision. That is to say, yeah, the FAR says you can't hire a contractor to do a job that an employee has to do. But it lists the kinds of jobs that an employee has to do. So I think that to be consistent with the spirit of the FAR, we should look at the things that the FAR says an employee has to do. And those are things where I think it may be especially problematic for a non-employee, meaning a machine or some kind of AI to do. Not because it violates acquisition law, but because it violates the principle behind the acquisition law that accountable individual employees are supposed to, who can be hired and fired, who can be disciplined, who can be supervised. Those are the kinds of people that should be making these particular kinds of decisions. So in one sense, the issue is the spirit of the FAR. But in the other, I think there's a very real risk that there are decisions that could be made, or there are activities that could be done that really are an outsourcing of through a procurement, the outsourcing of the government's capacity to make a decision. And I'm thinking in particular, since I come from the sentencing context, I'm thinking about, what would happen if a federal judge decided that, I think I'd like to subscribe to the Pennsylvania Sentencing Commission's software service, which is called the secret sentencing sauce. And what I need to do is I need to take my pre-sentence report and send it to Pennsylvania, and they're going to come back to me with a recommendation on what the sentence should be. Right? That's going to be a software service. There's not going to be an individual contractor who's involved, but I think that would violate the FAR, or at least that would potentially violate the FAR. That analysis would need to be done. It's not that there's a contractor making the decision, but the fact is that the government is procuring an act of discretion on the part of a software program and utilizing that. And I think that is potentially problematic.
Well, thank you very much. David Rubenstein, you're up next. And then once you're finished, I'll ask the general question whether anyone else wishes to be heard on this issue or whether we're ready to move on to data collection, standardization, and security. David?
Yeah, I'll just have two brief comments, and I don't know, they both might be out of the scope of what we're trying to do here in this framework. But one is that on the one hand, we have issues about compliance with FAR as it exists right now, but at the same time, there's a lot of talk about how administrative law and all these other regulatory areas of law will need retrofitting. And I've been thinking about and doing some research on the ways that the FAR probably will be or might be and arguably should be retrofitted. And I don't know if it's worth pointing out that, I mean, right now, in the DoD, the DFARS is being revamped in some pretty major ways, with probably many more to come in regards to the procurement of AI technologies. And I think that's going to migrate to the civil side relatively soon. So I don't know if it's worth flagging. I don't know if we're thinking about FAR as being out of scope for what we're sort of flagging in here, but I do think that's coming, and it's something that agencies might want to be thinking about. Because even if the FAR itself isn't amended, agencies have the ability to sort of change their own version of the FAR for purposes of an agency-specific FAR, and that's something that the FAR makes room to do. And the other issue or issue about outsourcing is what about when agencies just contract with somebody not to procure AI, but just contract for the kinds of things the government always contracts for, let's say for student loan collection, and the contractors using AI technologies. I mean, is that something that sort of within the scope of this? I'm not quite sure.
All right, thank you. We have Don Elliott and then Carrie Colanese here. Again, a warning to the group that after Carrie, I'll propose to move on. Don?
Just a very short comment, and that is that this notion of not delegating inherently governmental functions to private parties is broader than simply the language of the FAR. There are OMB circulars on this, but there's also a constitutional level to it based on Carter versus Carter-Cole. So I think we've got to be careful that we don't imply that this is only an issue under the FAR.
Thank you. Carrie?
John, can I just jump in real quickly? Reeve, apropos of Don Elliott's point, are there any prior recommendations of ACUS that address inherently governmental functions, whether in the context of discussing Circular A76 or the constitutional principles to which Don referred?
There are, yes. So there's, yeah, I believe it was 2011, I forget which number exactly, but it's the government contractor ethics recommendation where, yeah, we did grapple with this particular provision of the FAR as well as Circular A76 on inherently governmental functions. And as I'm sure the participants know, there's sort of a list of things under each of those, the FAR as well as Circular A76, as to things that may constitute inherently governmental functions. And perhaps it would be useful in the context of the next recommendation or next draft of the statement to walk through some of those, what might potentially be implicated, which is something we did also do in the context of that earlier recommendation. That was specifically with respect to rules governing ethics for government contractors. So the context was different, but we did actually grapple with those FAR provisions there, and perhaps doing something similar would be useful here as well.
Matt, anything further on this point?
No, I just wanted to identify the prior recommendation or recommendations and make clear that the inquiry was I think broader than just the FAR.
Okay, thank you. And a last comment from Carrie.
Yeah, I was just going to maybe pile on a little bit here and just say, if you imagine an agency that did not contract out but built its own internal services, the kinds of concern that Toby was articulating, I think would still apply, even though the FAR would not even be relevant at all. So I think we need to, in the draft, sharpen up exactly what the concerns are and how they relate to procurement sometimes, but maybe other times are broader than procurement.
All right, good. Thank you. See no other hands raised or chat requests come in. We'll now move to the last of the enumerated sections, data collection, standardization, and security. We have no volunteer to go first on this, so anyone who wishes, send in a chat note and you can proceed directly. And the award goes to John Kaminsky. And Steph Tatham will be second.
This
John?
doesn't capture, thank you. This doesn't capture the use of private sector data. Examples being the pings on people's cell phones for traffic management, or the use of social media comments to understand where people are coming out on regulatory comments or something. So this is not just agency data. This may be data that is in the private hands. So I just wanted to capture that.
All right, thank you. Steph?
Sure, and I think we've already signed up to work with Mark on this language, but just a couple of points that we wanted to make specifically in this section is that we would rather not include privacy just as a subcomponent of the data collection, standardization, and security, because as discussed above, we do think it's involved in each of the sections above. We think we should, in terms of privacy, broaden the focus beyond just collection and use to include sort of all of the elements of the data lifecycle. So creation, collection, use, processing, storage, maintenance, dissemination, and disclosure. In terms of the specific language where it says almost none of these concerns are unique to agency use of the AI, I think that there are perhaps some unique privacy challenges in AI, and some of that is, evident from the statement as drafted itself. So I think we'd suggest reframing that language. And then we wanted to point out that this section doesn't really talk about standardization or security, which are in the heading. So maybe the answer is just to delete that from the heading and rename it to focus on sort of data and privacy. But we wanted to note that in case there are specific points to be made on standardization and security that aren't reflected here.
Thank you. Does anybody wish to follow up? I see Matt's light is on. He's the only one with a green light on.
No, that was inadvertent. I apologize.
But I wanted to make certain I didn't cut off our Lord and Master here with things to say. Would anybody else like to be heard on this question? And if not, then I think why don't we progress to the issue that about the how is the formatting? How does that strike this for the members of the committee? This is one issue I think where the committee members really do have the ability to suggest how this should be made, since you're all prolific writers. As you can see now, it's mostly or entirely just narrative from beginning to end. We have to have some degree of narrative in the document, but the question is, do we want to break that up to some degree and have not bullet points exactly, but numerical points beneath the preambles to each of the 7 sections? I wonder if anybody has a presentation argument or a question about how it would be more persuasive if we changed the formatting so that it didn't just read like a long extended memo. And let's see, nobody up on that issue yet, but if you wish to take the floor, it's all yours. Nobody has raised their hand on this so far, but Nina Olson just came in. So Nina, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I don't know how we formatted past statements, but I personally didn't have a problem with this, partly because this is such a new issue and we're really trying, I think, in this statement to identify things and give a little bit of discussion, but it's also food for thought for going forward. So I, really didn't have a problem with it. The bullets sort of lend themselves to, do this, do this, do this, you should, you should, you should. And I don't think that's really part of what we're trying to do here. but I don't know. I don't know how we've handled statements going for, in the past. I don't have any recollection.
I don't know that I've ever seen a statement in the past.
They vary quite a bit. This will be one of the longer statements, and if the presentation sort of lends itself to numbered paragraphs, that would be fine. There's some advantages to having, I think, numbered paragraphs in that it's easier to refer and cite to it in the future. But I don't think that the ACUS staff has a strong preference on the matter. Is that fair, Reeve?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. And that they're different. I think there are two that we've issued recently, one on issue exhaustion, one on a delay issue. And I think one of them had more numbered paragraphs, the other one was more narrative. So I think just whatever the committee thinks works best here is good from our perspective, and I don't think it would be departing for past practice in any way.
Thank you. Does anybody else wish to be heard on the formatting issue? Carrie, Cognesi, one last comment on this?
Sure, just wondered if there's value if you do number the paragraphs or add headers or something for each paragraph. Would there be value in framing some of these issues as questions? So in effect, the statement becomes a bit of a checklist for agencies to go through and ask themselves questions. And maybe each paragraph then can kind of elaborate what the question is getting at, or what the agency should consider. But it might also make it clear. I was struck by something that Nina said, that this, which is obvious, this is a new innovative area for technology and for its application in government. And an interrogative statement might be actually the appropriate statement in this context, or a self-reflective comment or statement that would induce self-reflection. Maybe what's the appropriate tone or structure or format for this document.
I see John Kamensky nodding his head. John, do you wish to be heard?
That approach has been used very effectively by OMB in its guidance to agencies, and so I think that would make it a much more compelling way of framing it, and also not making it a directive. I think what we're trying to do is create a conversation.
Thank you. Does anybody else wish to be heard? No one else seems to be to have anything to be said on this issue at the end of a long 2 hours. But we do want to save time for the last issue here, which is, Matt, I think you probably have the lead on this one, which is potential projects for the conference regarding AI. I thought of this more as a pure brainstorming session for people to start getting their ideas out in a way that the other members of the committee could hear it, and ACUS could get a sense of what might be suggested for it. And given the limited period of time, it may be necessary for ACUS staff to follow up with the people who have the ideas. But that's the best I could make of it. So I thought I'd pass it over to you, Matt.
Yeah, let me just say a word or two, and then I'll turn it over to Reeve to see if he has any additional thoughts. This is, as the council conceived it, an important part of the project, which is to say for the committee and then ultimately the assembly to identify areas of further study for ACUS. Or I suppose if the committee were confident in suggesting that ACUS should begin a particular project with an eye towards making recommendations, I think that would also be an appropriate use of this section of the statement. In terms of the content, I defer to the committee. Reeve, further thoughts on that?
No, I don't think I really have anything to add. I think that tees it up perfectly. That's really what we're looking for. It is an important part of the project. It's actually included in the project description, so we very much welcome the committee's input on what types of studies and what areas ACUS might profitably look at in the future.
It may also be that the committee's of the view that given the two existing reports and the expertise that resides in this committee, that the committee would be comfortable suggesting that ACUS, not in this context, but in a subsequent project, maybe in the spring, that ACUS take up the task of making some recommendations on a particular topic here. So that would be fair game too, in addition to suggesting additional study that ACUS might undertake. Now, the two are probably related to some extent, but just keep in mind that that the committee could go a little bit further if it thought it appropriate, beyond simply suggesting areas for study, but rather suggesting areas based on or subjects based on the state of the existing research where recommendations to agencies on specific topics might be appropriate, whether it's due process or transparency or capacity building or whatever it is.
Thank you, Matt. Sid, would you lead off the discussion?
I was actually thinking rather than a horizontal division, a vertical one, because we've talked about various potential uses, machine learning, identification of people for inspections. There seems to be a wide variety. And concerning any one of those, it may well be all these cross-cutting subjects that we've discussed in this recommendation might or might not apply in a particular area. So I don't know whether any of these are further enough along that they would be worthy of study, or whether we could identify some that are particularly important. But that kind of vertical division might be another way of thinking about it.
Thank you. Carrie?
Yeah, I was going to suggest something rather similar to Sid, although I don't know that that was to build on the extraordinary work that David and Daniel and Kathy and Tino have produced with this broad survey of all the uses, and maybe, identify several uses across different agencies in the same area, such as Sid says, for targeting for inspections or enforcement. Where I might differ a little bit from Sid is that maybe even within those concrete areas, it might be necessary to proceed even more incrementally and just say, let's look at what kind of transparency is needed about inspection algorithms. So maybe we don't, investigate everything, but that could be, I think, a useful way of going. And the other thought I wanted to share was just about the format and the statement. I mean, right now, the statement seems to suggest that maybe these additional ideas for projects would appear at the end of the statement. I don't know if that was intended or not, but I would suggest keeping the statement separate from suggested projects. If ACUS requires a statement of separate projects, I would put that in a separate document of some sort, rather than kind of putting that into what I think could be a very powerful, again, checklist, if you will, of issues for agencies to consider as they go forward with these projects.
Will the suggestions be taken to the full council for review? I was not certain about what we would do with the ideas once they're generated, or whether ACUS would just go right ahead and talk to the consultants about what might be done in these areas.
The council contemplated that suggestions for further study would reside in the statement, but I don't think it has to work that way. The committee could decide that it doesn't want to put any suggested areas in the statement, but rather would prefer to sort of deal with that as a side matter. I think that would be perfectly fine if the committee's more comfortable with that. The other thing I think it might be worth thinking about, I don't know, not necessarily now, but maybe for the next meeting, is whether there's a role here for, on an ongoing basis, for ACUS's Office of the Chairman, as we sometimes call it, to help carry out one of its missions under the Administrative Conference Act, which is to provide for interchange among agencies on various of matters of so-called mutual concern. We just, for instance, establish a council on administrative adjudication to try to break down the silo effect among adjudicative programs. And we found that already to be a very effective mechanism for agencies to share information. So one thing the committee might think about is whether ACUS should institutionalize some kind of agency information exchange mechanism. I think we would have to be careful on that front to ensure that we were not stepping on anyone else's toes, like, for instance, GSAs. But ACUS is pretty good about not stepping on other agencies' toes. Reeve, any thoughts on that? On any of those, anything I said?
No, I think that frames it nicely. That we're also very interested in potential input on Office of the Chairman projects that wouldn't be, geared toward production of a recommendation, and that sort of interchange body might be, something that could be valuable and would be interested in the committee's input on, if that's it's something that's worth undertaking.
Can I build on your suggestion, Matt, about possibly having, some kind of interagency forum? Those are wonderful opportunities for mutual learning across the government. And so that in itself is a good reason to contemplate that. But I think there's also another role that ACUS could play in this, and it goes back to the audience even for this statement. But in general, there needs to be greater public awareness about the nature of these tools, about the thoughtfulness of government agencies as they approach the development and use of these tools. And I hope if it's not ACUS, someone in the federal government is thinking about ways to promote greater public awareness and understanding and improve the total deliberation in society about the use of these tools and what it means for government. That, it seems to me, is as important of a purpose or effect of this statement and this process and any future work that ACUS does, perhaps as anything that goes on in terms of dialogue within government.
I think that's a very good suggestion. I'd rather not sort of give an off-the-cuff response to it, but rather give it a little bit of thought before the next meeting. But it's a very good suggestion.
Let's see, we have a couple more comments. First, Bradford Brown, and then Don Elliott.
Yeah, look, I think the notion of putting together something like that is really interesting, because I don't think there's really a broad understanding of how AI is being used in different agencies in different focus areas. So I think one of the things that would be really interesting is to have a dialogue about actually what that is and what that isn't, because I think we'd probably be surprised at some level about how deeply or not some agencies have gone with this. So I think that's a great idea.
Thank you. And Don, I think you'll have the last word today.
It's a big bird, a big responsibility. One thing I wanted to note is the possibility for studies down the road, Matt, is potential side-by-side analysis. I think that in the autonomous vehicles area, that's been the gold standard in terms of getting public acceptance. Is when you can, what they're trying to show is that autonomous vehicles are actually safer than vehicles that are driven by humans. And I think that when we have side-by-side experiences, I think Kerry's good point in his report that AI may actually be fairer and more accurate in some applications than traditional human decision making. So I think that we're not at a point to be able to do that yet, but we might look for some examples where we can study, where we can have consultants study from a side-by-side comparison standpoint. I think that'll do a lot to help the public understand and accept.
Very good point. Very interesting point. Does anybody else wish to be heard? We've got about 2 minutes left before we get cut off by the provider.
Just another job well done, John. To you.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to have a group with this much intellectual firepower and get to see it at work. And I look forward to when we can reconvene for the third time on Monday, the 23rd of November. Thank you all very much.
John, I would like to just single out Mark for doing the behind the scenes work of drafting that statement. Obviously, it's based on Dan's and Kathy's and Carrie's and David's reports, but Mark put a lot of time in and I think did a really extraordinary job, which is reflected in the comments today. So anyway, I do want to thank, in addition to you and the committee members, I do want to single out Mark in particular for our thanks.
If I won't disrupt events, I see that Toby Dorsey has a final point and Catherine's light is on. So I wonder if we can try to fit in 2 more comments. And Dan Ho just came up with a thank you, sorry.
Hi, John, this is Toby. Very quickly, in terms of the drafting of this, I'd like to suggest, not that we go through too laborious an effort, but I think this statement would benefit from referring to past recommendations and other ACUS products, and including the reports that we have from this particular effort, but things in the past as well. I don't have anything in particular in mind, but it struck me that it doesn't really have any reference to anything that ACUS has done in the past.
All right, thank you. And Catherine sent a note that she had to sign off for another meeting, so she's just left the conference. So I think that at this point we truly are finished, and I will adjourn the committee until the 23rd of November. Thank you all very much for participating.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.